All right, Matt Mabe, welcome to the Indie Magazine.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So we got connected because you are on the 100th Bomb Group Foundation. Is that correct?
That's right. I'm on the board of the 100th Foundation and do some of our historical work and our social media. And I'm also good friends with Rebecca Hutchinson, who you guys recently interviewed as well.
She told me as soon as you guys had talked, she pinged me and said, "You haven't talked to Matt yet. You need to go ahead and get a hold of him." I was going to ask, how did you first get involved with the 100th?
I think everybody comes at this through a different line of interest, but in my case, I've always been fascinated with the people, with the personal stories. And a gentleman from my hometown in North Carolina was in the 100th and really fostered my interest. And I'd always been interested in World War II history, especially the air war. And this gentleman brought me to a reunion many years ago, and I was pleasantly surprised to see it wasn't just, like a social gathering. It was that, but it was also, they were very committed to, the historical side of things of furthering this history. So I just kind of got bitten by the bug, so to speak, and I've been with them ever since.
It's not a familial connection, but rather someone in your community that helped foster that.
I consider this guy a grandfather type figure, but no blood relation to the 100th.
That's great. Now, as far as the 100th goes, I know there's been many books written in the past, and then the show has come about through a few of those books kind of tied in. When did you first hear that there was going to be a show made, or the first inklings that this might be done by, Spielberg and Plato?
So I personally heard about it back when they secured the rights to the book, to Don Miller's book, which was, over 10 years ago now. But others in the foundation had been working closely with Don and had some foreknowledge of that pretty early in the process. But I would say 2013 is really where it kind of took off in terms of knowing that there was something big coming down the road.
And from 2013, how did they get involved with members of the 100th Bomb Group Foundation or families and get kind of connected to people personally beyond just the book?
So they had been doing a lot of research since 2013, gathering information. You've seen some comments from John Orloff about, writing the Bible for the series. So there was a lot of research and preparation early on. But, once it was actually announced that Apple was going to pick up the series, that's when it really went into overdrive in terms of, a lot of additional fact finding now that they knew it was going to move forward. And they had a good idea of where they wanted to go with this project and the script. So they were very focused in, wanting certain pieces of information, certain pieces of, biographical type information on certain people, the works.
No small undertaking. And what was your role in that? I mean, did you help to facilitate or connect people, or were you just aware of it going on with members of the group?
So I was one of a few guys who's been working with the production team for several years now, and both gathering everything from photographic material to veterans' recollections, or there might be a scenario where they say, "Hey, we're trying to make a determination of what happened in this specific scenario. Does someone know?" Or sometimes, you've probably heard in some of the other podcast interviews, just their focus and attention to detail. I think they had said devotion to detail, which is a very nice way of saying it. So there were little things like wanting to know like what religion a guy was, or verifying where a guy was from in the US, because you've probably seen in the series, there's some Southern accents incorporated. So they tried to be as historically accurate as possible, which we greatly appreciate. So throughout this, we were willing to provide them with whatever we could in furtherance of that effort.
Did you get your name in the credits?
My name is, you don't quite need a magnifying glass to see it, but I am one of the credited historical consultants.
Oh, that's really cool.
Along with my good friend Mike Faley, who's been a long-time historian for the 100th. So this was certainly a team effort, and there are certainly people that, contributed that may not have their name in the credits, but it's, very satisfying to see it come this far.
I was going to say, I think I just messaged Mike Faley the other day because I had made some posts about Rebecca's episode in a couple of the Facebook groups. And he, I checked with him to make sure it was kosher to post in there about it. So yeah, we had a little back and forth. Very cool.
Yeah. And I'll say one thing that's different with this series than others is they had the veterans to rely upon for Band of Brothers and even the Pacific to an extent. So this one was a far greater challenge in that, Don Miller had interviewed some of these guys at the latter years of their lives, but the main characters, none of them were here during the course of this. So we're relying upon the historical record and, things like Harry Crosby's book to to guide us towards those answers.
Based on like watching the episodes that you've seen so far, how well did they do?
They did a great job, and I realize it's very difficult in that you have to, with any project like this, you have to scope it, and they started with a lot and had to condense it, and probably would have loved to have done 15 episodes if costs permitted. But I think they've done a great job. It's uncharted territory in the sense of no one's ever shown anything like this on the screen. So I think it's very impressive. I think many of us has been emotional at certain points watching it because you either knew some of the guys that are being portrayed there, or you think about another veteran who had that experience. So it's very emotional to see it play out like this in a very realistic way.
Yeah, I know in a lot of our conversations about the show, it's the reminder that these were young men, oftentimes younger than most of the viewers watching, out here doing, charged with a heroic task in uncharted territory, working on these planes. The first time this had been done to that extent, or, kind of emerging technologies, and not everything was in place to be where it is today of parachutes, proper ordnance checks, whatever else. So it's definitely been quite something to watch, to see.
And I thought it was very moving when I was in Los Angeles for the premiere. We had 4 of our veterans with us, and when Tom Hanks introduced them and gave a statement before the episode started, he said, I'm going to ask these guys to stand, but don't think of them as you see them now. Think of them as 19-year-old guys who are fresh out of high school, and put that in perspective. So it's interesting to ponder for sure.
I mean, that was my first like observation when watching this one, Masters of the Air, versus watching like Band of Brothers. When you're watching Band of Brothers, the actors look like adult men, right? And it doesn't occur to you that they're 19, 20 years old. But I feel like the casting did a really good job of getting really boyish looking guys to really like reinforce the fact that these are just children going off and doing these heroic things. And like, it's really, it is, I think that's one of the hallmarks and the standouts of this series for me, is realizing just how young these guys were.
Yeah, I thought the casting was phenomenal. And I think about the fact that, not only were these guys like 19, 20-year-old guys doing stuff, you had 20-year-old pilots leading a crew where like 9 guys were dependent upon your decisions. I can't imagine what decisions I'd be making when I was 20 in terms of flying into, the lion's den of Germany. So that's certainly true. And I think another thing about the casting, I've been fortunate to have talked to a lot of the guys who have been in this series, and I'm just blown away by how respectful these guys are of the veterans' legacies, and just how much this planted the seed for them of like wanting to learn more, or reaching out to me and saying like, Matt, can you tell me like what happened to this guy after the war? So it's been impressive to see how much it's meant to them.
Now, knowing you got to kind of be behind the scenes and help work on it, have you watched the entire series yet, or are you watching week to week with everybody else?
I've seen the entire series, but it's different when you get to watch it still piece by piece. It's almost like seeing it for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, I love by the end of it how they do show a little bit on those info cards of where each person went after the war and what they did. And knowing, I mean, my grandfather was not in combat, but he was kind of post-war combat stationed in Germany, but came back to become a principal. And just kind of talking to Rebecca and hearing how Harry came back, got a PhD, and then was teaching and was out in, Boston University and Harvard Writing School. And then to see each of the Tuskegee Airmen shown on the show who were teachers or professors in Chicago, Detroit, or, an air school down in Alabama. Pretty amazing to kind of see how each one moved past the war and did something to not only better the community, but just to be productive and didn't get stuck in, I guess, a rut in that way. Do you feel like with the foundation, you have more of those stories, or kids who can tell those stories of it wasn't just the war, here's what happened to my parents afterwards?
I think so. I think so for sure. And it's interesting. The gentleman that I mentioned that got me involved with the 100th, this guy had a very similar career to Harry Crosby. Became a PhD and educator in English language. And this guy greatly admired Harry Crosby. He actually got to fly with Harry at the end of the war. And so, I mean, these guys we learned about some of these guys, but there's so many like this that just went off and did amazing things in their lives. And as you said, helped better their communities and stayed interconnected with one another. I'm glad we're doing this now, because a few days ago you might have seen Apple release that they're doing a documentary that will follow the series. So I think having spent a lot of time helping with that as well. It does offer some good vignettes into who the real people were. So I think that's something that folks will really enjoy learning about.
Yeah, I saw that. I think comes out March 13th or 15th or something like
Yeah,
that.
15th after
15th.
episode.
That's great. Yeah, I'm definitely going to check that out. And I hadn't seen it on our screener site yet, so it made me excited. I was like, there's something more. So we're going to have to go give it a watch. As far as I know, having been in now some of the 100th or the 8th Air Force groups on Facebook and reading those for a few weeks, or even just knowing and having military historians in the family or friends, it's always easy to kind of pick apart what they think is accurate or not accurate. When making the show, how did some of those decisions come down, or were you consulted on things where they decided to go maybe a more fictional route or something that was a little bit up in the air?
So I think a lot of those things were outside of our, not necessarily outside of our purview, but outside of our control to influence. And I think you've probably heard some of the statements from the folks involved. They've made every effort to keep it as accurate as possible in the sense of not including any composite characters or something like that. But understandably, certain timelines have to be condensed. They didn't, fake missions or anything like that, but they did have to condense certain timelines just to, make it fit in terms of the 9 episodes and have it be as, fluid as possible in terms of like continuity so the viewer can appreciate what's going on. But thankfully, from what I've seen, like with any production, there's always going to be things that, you might have shot and then after the fact, you're like, I wish we had, now that we've looked into it, we should have said this instead of that. There's always going to be these little things, but I think these guys did a fantastic job of trying to be as accurate as possible. And I think it certainly shows in the final product.
You already kind of mentioned the fact that for Masters of the Air versus like Band of Brothers, the source material is getting further and further in the past, and so I guess my question is, as versus like 20 years ago, we still had a lot of veterans alive who were there during World War II and could tell their stories. Can you speak to the importance of telling these stories now that World War II is becoming more in the past and we don't actually have like a direct voices to speak on it anymore? Can you talk about the value of continuing to tell these stories?
Yeah, I think it's as important as it's ever been. There's, certainly history repeats itself, and it's important to have these lessons taught. And I think one nice thing that's come out is if, you think back to 20 years ago when Band of Brothers came out, you would see a lot more veteran interviews and things like that. We've seen that to some extent now. There have been some veterans that have, given interviews and when they've been able to preserve their stories. But I think this has also encouraged, sons and daughters and grandsons to like go in the closet and like finally get that box of stuff out. And so we've actually been inundated in a good way with people reaching out saying like, I found this photo, I found this diary, can you take a look at this? And like, it's been busier than ever. But I think that's been one of the net benefits that's come from this is that the next generation are the people that are going to continue this story and this legacy. So if it inspires them to go dig out that photo album and scan it or let us scan it, they're helping further that story. Even though the veteran's not here to give that firsthand account, we can help preserve some of those stories and keep it going. So I think that's what it's about, because the stories of sacrifice are no matter what year you're looking at, these are important stories that I think resonate, especially if when they're told in a way like this that really, the viewer can understand.
I'd imagine a lot of people listening have friends, family, or people in their community who did serve in World War II or in other conflicts. What would you say is a good first step for them to do what you were just saying of go into the closet, dig those things out? Are you guys saving images and history in an archive or somewhere at a different university, or is it all located online? What does that look like?
So every group's different. I'm certainly biased in our approach to this because we have a massive online archive, and we've tried to get as much as we can online. Like, all due respect to some other institutions, but like it's always disappointing when you see, oh hey, you can come see this if you like make an appointment and go look in these archives, and it's like you have to make it available. It has to be readily accessible, otherwise it defeats the purpose. So we have both physical archives and online archives, but I get a lot of friends that will hit me up and say like, oh, hey, I learned you're involved in this process. Like, let me ask you about my grandfather's service. And what I tell them is, start online. Like, are there any groups, whether it be like Facebook or web pages, like, are there any groups dedicated to the unit they served in? Like, go get what you have. You got to scan that stuff. Start peeling it back and see, because there's so much interest right now. Like unless you served in some really, really obscure unit, like there's somebody out there that is doing the same thing you're doing. But you got to take the first step and going through stuff and being curious. But it's like so pleasantly surprising and just like pleasing when people reach out and, you know, they've taken a lot of these steps and they're trying to like connect with other family members. It's just like really heartwarming to see that stuff happen.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like I know I come from a culture, and so does Madison, of doing a lot of family history and ancestry and genealogy work and compiling those things because we have to have that connection. How do you feel like this show or others, like you said, inspires people to go looking? What do we need to do for the next generation or the next 20 years? How do we kind of keep that going and not forget about these things?
I think there's always going to be more stories to tell. I think that's the unique aspect of World War II is there's so many different stories to tell. But, you know, there's whether your grandfather or grandmother served in during other conflicts, during other periods of time, they still have an important story to tell as well. So I think the biggest piece is just getting folks interested. And in our case, we still are very active in having reunions and events. And while the reunions are a social thing, they're more than that. Like we have like historical symposiums. Like when you come, you're getting your money's worth in terms of like we have a lot of stuff to do to convey that, because it is a second family for a lot of people. For the 100th, it's like you're the family you never knew you had for a lot of these people that are coming for the first time. But I think it's really important for us to, you know, make that as value added as we can, so that you have like the grandsons really come up and say like, hey, what can I do? Like, I'm really interested in this now. So I think that's the most important thing that comes from this, is just getting those folks to help carry the torch for these veterans that aren't here to do it themselves.
You know, for the next generation, what's the next story to tell, right? We've had Band of Brothers, we've had the Pacific, we've had Masters of the Air. Is there another piece of the puzzle, piece of the story that deserves the light?
I don't know. You know, it's interesting. That's a hard one to answer, but I'll answer it this way. I'm always a fan of looking at like what's some obscure thing that we don't know. So even like within the 100th history, I'll find people that have like obscure jobs, and I'm like, why do we have nothing on this guy? Let's like, here's a guy who was like in the band for the 100th. Like we have nothing on him. Let's find his family and write his story. And so in the like current issue of our newsletter, like we're telling the story of this guy who like started the band that you saw in one of the episodes. So I'm a fan of finding those obscure topics. So, you know, there's certainly things like you could do. People have said like, can Hanks and Spielberg do something about the Navy or something like that? Some of that's outside of my expertise, but I do think it's worth going and finding like some of these stories of guys that made an impact, but you know, their story may have fallen through the cracks of history. So I certainly hope this encourages people to go tell them, whether it's like a made for TV movie or a 10-part series, like whatever it is, there's a lot of stories to tell out there.
Yeah, all this talk is making me wonder now. Do you have a general idea of how many members of the 100th are still alive today? I mean, do you guys keep records of who's passed and who's still coming to your reunions?
We do. We keep very meticulous records, and I'm in contact with all of our living veterans. So there's about 10 guys from the 100th that are still with us, and it's sad to see my friends go. But all the guys who are with us now are all at the age of 99, 100, 102 is our oldest. So these guys are going strong, and like I said, 4 of them were able to make the trip out to LA for the premiere. And all these guys have one thing in common: it's like they're not coming to these things for the accolades or the applause. All of them feel a debt of like, I need to represent my guys, my friends who can't be here. So it's like, it's really moving to see like when these guys make that effort to be there for their friends who can't be here.
I know in talking to Rebecca, as well as we just spoke with Fred Bell, the managing director of the Palm Springs Air Museum. He said the same thing of most of these guys don't talk about the war willy-nilly or off the cuff. It's a very like intense thing, but they all talk about the friendships, the relationships, those bonds that they made, and that you know, that band of brothers, that brotherhood that really seems to pop out in this show. And I'm so glad that you were instrumental in helping these stories be told, because it feels genuine while watching it. It feels like these guys are all buddies and, you know, brothers in arms, really working hard together to keep each other safe, and that's the whole reason that's really driving them.
Yeah, and one story I'll tell you. We have in our latest issue of our newsletter, there's a obituary for 2 guys who passed away somewhat recently, and it's interesting because both were on the same crew. They're the last 2 guys who were alive that were on the same crew. And I'll try to tell this without getting emotional saying it, but these guys were both POWs. And one of the guys, his feet were really bad off at the end when they were forced to march through the snow, which, is referenced in Don Miller's book. And the guy said, like, I can't go on. And his friend literally helped carry him through that. And when I talked to him in 2019, I said, like, what was going through your mind there? And he said, this is my best friend. Like, there was no question that, like, I'm going to be there for my best friend. So it's just, I think that's what draws people to this so much. We all, I think deep down kind of wish, like, everyone can experience that same kind of brotherhood that these guys felt, where, like, you're 19, 20 years old and it's a fraternity that you carry for the rest of your life. So, like, these guys dying day, they're thinking of their guys, of their friends.
The fact that the show is being done and we're having these stories shared, I think that is important, because I feel in the last 20, 30 years, there's been a lot of questions of should we tell the stories, and there's patriotism versus nationalism, and it can get a little murky at times, but especially watching the series as well as the other two, I feel like it's very clear that this is the story of the boys who went through it. This is not something political or otherwise. This is just talking about the relationships of those people who, like you're saying, were best friends, who are just trying to get through it.
Yeah, and I'm always a fan of, like, staying out of the political frame, like historical things, as much as you can. But, like, I think that's the beauty of some of these guys' stories. It's very black and white in terms of, like, these guys will tell you, they're like, I answered the call and that's what I did. They tell it in a very, transparent, linear way of, like, Pearl Harbor happened and I did X, Y, and Z. Like, that's what I was called to do. So I hope while we have so few World War II veterans here still with us, I think one hope is that, people who haven't been interviewed, someone will go interview them, or even if you served in other conflicts in history, I hope it just encourages people to go out and try to learn those stories and preserve them.
I don't want to diverge too much, but I do want to ask you, I feel like I have not seen much about Korea and Vietnam for some obvious reasons, but maybe some others. Do you think there's a reason that we point back to World War II so often with American cinema and film and television versus some of the other stories, more recent or also just not so black and white and some of our lenses?
I think purely my own speculation, I think it is exactly as you said, of, like, it's less black and white. I think, even at the conclusion of Harry Crosby's book, he talks about it was, clear, like, these guys were we were on the side of good, they were on the side of bad. We had a clear purpose. So I think it's a easier story to tell in terms of, it not being controversial, in the sense of these guys were trying to take over the world and we had to stop them. And some of these other conflicts in history are harder to interpret through such a black and white lens. So yeah, I think it is more difficult. But we had a number of 100 Bomb Group veterans that stayed in the service, served in Korea and Vietnam, and though they had tight close friends from those other conflicts, it was their World War II experiences that I think they always came back to. That was really their brotherhood they came back to.
Yeah, I wanted to say one of the cards at the end of the series said that, was it Buck or Bucky that served in Korea? I don't remember.
Yeah, Egan served in Korea. Clevin stayed in the military through Korea in the early part of Vietnam. Wow. So it's funny, while these guys in the, like, when you watch, like, episode 1, you probably can't picture, like, these two guys are gonna, like, spend their career in the military, but that's, like, exactly what they did, despite some of their, I'll say, like, antics and their lighthearted approach to things. These were very serious guys who, like, were deeply passionate about what it is they had signed up for. So it certainly reflected in the fact that they both served for quite some time after the war.
Now, just speculative or your own, opinion here, what are some stories you would like to see on screen? I know you talked about the member of the band for the 100th or otherwise. Are there stories you've heard that you thought, this needs to be a movie or a show, or if I was screenwriting, I would do this?
I do wish it was possible to continue on this story, because there's so many unique stories of the guys who serve in the 8th Air Force. This one's like a microcosm of that, but I wish there was a little more where we could explore, like, what the guys went through on the ground. And I'll tell, like, one quick anecdote on that. Like, we see a lot of, like, the horrors of, like, what happens to guys in the air, but there were things that happened to the guys on the ground as well. I did some research on one guy from a ground crew who was killed. So I think there's a lot of, we don't necessarily think about those guys being in harm's way, but it's the guys doing some of the, underappreciated jobs at times that were sacrificing just as much as the guys in the air. So I do hope, I'm glad Rafferty Law has done such a great job of representing Ken Lemons in this, because I do think a lot of the guys on the ground were really the unsung heroes of this story too.
Yeah, who's the character who was like the mechanic for the planes?
Yeah, so Ken Lemons, really the main
Lemons, yeah.
two ground crew folks featured are Ken Lemons and John Herman, the other guy that's with Ken, and they kind of, there were a lot. In reality, there were a lot of ground crew guys, not just the mechanics, but the guys loading bombs or like cleaning the machine guns. There are a lot of guys. So these guys are kind of representative of the other guys that can't be featured, since it's hard to show them all. But you can't do what you do as a pilot without the guys on the ground who are working around the clock to make it happen. And it's pretty neat. Like, a lot of people, after they saw that episode of Ken Lemons up in like the wheel well of the plane, they're like, "Oh, that's Hollywood. That's so fake." That happened. Like, Ken Lemons actually did that. So that's another thing I appreciate about this series. All the little things that people think are far fetched. It's like, no, that really happened. Like, these guys really did do those incredible acts.
Yeah, the entire time I was just like, wow, I really hope this guy makes it to the end and then there's not some accident, because I really like him.
Ken survived and had an impressive career.
That's pretty amazing. Rafferty Law did a good job portraying him. I know in talking to Rebecca, it was shocking to me that she had never met Anthony Boyle until they actually had the premiere, and I didn't realize the timeline of so much of this happening during COVID. But as far as the surviving members of the 100th right now, were there others that were portrayed in the show?
Of the guys that are still living, no, none of them are portrayed in the show. I don't think it's any secret that several of the guys who are still living were interviewed for this process, and were interviewed also for the documentary piece that's coming out. But I think one of the slight exceptions to this, when I was watching the episode about Munster, you'll remember the scene where Harding is in the tower and he says, "Where are our boys?" and he realizes they're not coming back. There's a young guy sitting at the desk there that's in the tower, and so it's an uncredited role because the guy doesn't have a line, but that guy is still living. His name's David Woolman. He's 102. Wow. He's the last living veteran that was in the control tower and was there, when the guys didn't come back from Munster. So even though he doesn't have a speaking role, David can kind of claim to be the one person that is in this series, since he was there.
Well, is there anything you would like to talk about as far as how people can get involved with the 100th or with their own areas? Is there any way people can volunteer or get in contact with one of these groups?
Yeah, I'd say in general, definitely, especially if it's World War II aviation groups, they tend to be a little more involved than other branches of the service. Like, go find those organizations if they exist. It's Facebook's been kind of a blessing and a curse, but like, it is great for connecting with some of these organizations. So I definitely encourage people to do that. But if anybody's listening that has a relative that was in the 100th, we're, if anything, this series has generated a lot of work for us in a positive way, in the sense that we're working on a museum project here in the States. We have one in England, but the veterans had always hoped to have a museum display here. And so we're trying to carry that torch to do that. So we've got a lot on our website about that, and would certainly welcome any extended family of 100th veterans to engage with us and come to our next reunion. I hope perhaps you guys can make it, our next reunion in New Orleans in 2025. So it's going to be big.
That would be great. That'd be great. And I guess last question before we kind of wrap up, have you been over to England to Thorpe Abbott? Have you been to the sites?
I have. Thorpe Abbott's is hallowed grounds. I've been there many times, and I'm dear friends with the trustees that run the museum. And it was interesting. I was able to go over to England right when they lifted the COVID restrictions, and was able to go visit the set when they were filming Masters of the Air. And it was like something out of Field of Dreams. It was like you're walking into a dream that is like this. It was like so emotional in the sense of, it seems you knew it wasn't real, but it seemed and just looked so real. And it's too bad that set could not endure there where they built it. But thankfully you can go see the real thing at Thorpe Abbott's, and the folks there, just as a testament to the work they've done over the years. The volunteers there, before Queen Elizabeth passed away, they were awarded the Queen's Award for Voluntary Service, which is the equivalent of like being knighted for a veteran for an organization. So just an incredible testament to, their, blood, sweat, and tears of keeping this history alive for so many decades. So it's really impressive if you have a chance to get over there and see it.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I was sad I didn't go visit. I did a master's over there recently, and that was on my list, but never made it out there. So I know next time I go, I got to go check it out.
Their opening season is in about 2 days, so I expect
there we go.
a lot of visitors, and they're not going anywhere. So you can catch them on the next UK trip for sure.
Well, that's great. And it's great that there's some place keeping history alive in that way. And I think on behalf of us and anyone who's watching the show or otherwise, thank you for the work you're doing to keep history alive and to keep these stories, protected, saved, as well as bringing them to the light for people to read and to understand the people behind the great effort and what could be a couple paragraphs in the history book and making it that much more real.
I'm certainly one member of a big team who's doing a lot, and likewise appreciate what you guys are doing too and keeping this at the forefront.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for coming on tonight.
Sure. Thanks, guys.
Matt.